Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be looking at something pretty foundational to Western philosophy, I'd say, and that is this idea of the distinction between form and matter.
Yeah.
And I think anyone who's ever really thought about like what makes a thing what it is and how things change is going to find this a really fascinating discussion.
I think so too. And actually, what makes this deep dive, I think, especially kind of engaging, is that it's not just a historical thing. This idea is still very much alive. I mean, the core of what Aristotle called hylomorphism, which is, this idea that every physical object is somehow a union of matter and form, is something that people are still talking about and arguing about in contemporary philosophical discussions.
Absolutely. And to help us kind of navigate all of this, we're going to be drawing insights from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy today.
Okay.
So think of this as kind of your, guided tour to grasping a truly foundational concept.
Yeah.
Our goal really is to unpack Aristotle's understanding of matter, which is houle, and form, which is eidos or morphe. And we'll be tracing how that kind of originated in his physics and developed further in his metaphysics.
Yes.
Now, I will say, even for seasoned philosophical minds, this area is one that presents kind of intricate challenges and ongoing debates.
It really does. And that sort of brings up, I think, a crucial point for our philosophical listener today. Like, how do we approach such a nuanced and much debated topic in a way that actually illuminates the core ideas without, getting totally lost in all the scholarly tangents and debates?
Yeah.
So, what we're going to try to do is give you a clear but sophisticated overview, acknowledging, the complexities, but always keeping kind of the central tenets of Aristotle's thought in view for you.
Okay, so why did Aristotle even introduce this distinction between matter and form?
Yeah.
I mean, our sources say that it kind of came out of his investigations in physics, his investigation into the natural world.
Yes.
He was struggling with the very basic question: how do things come to be without literally being created out of nothing? The old ex nihilo problem.
Exactly. And to understand kind of how he answered that question.
Yeah.
I think it's really crucial to grasp these two kinds of change that Aristotle differentiated. So there's what we call accidental change, and that's when an existing thing alters its properties.
Yeah.
So think of, Socrates getting a pan. Socrates is still there.
Yeah.
His color has changed.
Yeah.
And then there's the much more radical substantial change.
Right.
This involves like a substance itself coming into existence or passing away entirely. So Socrates being born or indeed ceasing to be, to account for substantial change. Aristotle reasoned that three elements must be at play. Exactly.
Really?
So first, there has to be something that persists throughout the change. Secondly, there has to be a privation or a lack, the absence of a particular form.
Yeah.
And thirdly, there has to be the form that is acquired at the end of that process.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's maybe try to illustrate that with accidental change.
Right.
Socrates learning to play the flute.
Yes.
So Socrates, the individual, persists.
Yeah.
The initial state is a lack of musical ability, and then the change results in the acquisition of that skill of musicality.
Exactly. And now here's where it gets, I think, particularly interesting, is when we apply this to substantial change.
Okay.
Since a new substance can't already exist to undergo the change, right?
Right.
The underlying thing has to be even more fundamental. It has to be matter.
Matter. Okay.
Matter. So consider a house being constructed.
Right.
The bricks exist before the house, and they remain as the house takes shape. They transition from not being a house to being components of a house.
And Aristotle, as our source reminds us, uses examples like houses a lot.
Yes, he does.
Because it's so easy to identify the underlying material.
Yeah.
But he was very clear that the same analysis applies to natural substances.
Absolutely.
To living organisms.
Yeah.
An acorn becomes an oak tree. A fetus develops into an adult human.
Yes.
In all these cases, matter persists.
Yes.
And this was crucial for Aristotle because it allowed him to kind of navigate that Parmenidean challenge. That being cannot come from non-being.
Right.
Nothing just kind of pops into or out of existence.
Yeah.
There has to be this underlying...
Absolutely. And it's really crucial for you as a philosopher to appreciate that for Aristotle, form is much more
Okay.
than just physical shape. I mean, yes, the shape of a bronze statue
Yeah.
is a kind of form. But when we talk about living things,
Mm-hmm.
form refers to the thing's definition, its essence.
Right. What it means to be a human being.
Right.
And this is very closely tied to function.
Okay.
So a statue shaped like a human might have the outward form,
Mm-hmm.
but it lacks all the essential capacities.
Right.
Reason, satience, self-nutrition, all the things that actually define a human being.
That make it a living,
breathing human.
And this naturally leads us to Aristotle's famous
Okay.
4 causes, or perhaps more accurately, 4 types of explanation: material, formal, efficient, and final.
Okay, so the material cause is simply what something is made of.
Yeah.
The bronze of the statue, the flesh and bone
Or the table
of a human.
Yeah.
Okay. And then we have the formal cause,
Mm-hmm.
the blueprint, so to speak,
Right.
the defining structure or essence.
Yeah.
For the statue, it's the shape that the sculptor imposes on the bronze
Mm-hmm.
for a human being. It's the soul,
Right.
understood as that principle of life.
And the capacity for rational thought.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have the efficient cause,
Yeah.
which is what brings the thing into being. So
Right.
the sculptor's actions on the bronze,
Yeah.
the parents procreating,
Okay.
and finally the final cause,
Mhm.
the purpose or the end for which something exists.
Right.
So the statue might be for decoration,
Mm-hmm.
while a human being's final cause, in Aristotle's view, is often understood as flourishing or eudaimonia, a life lived well according to reason.
And I think what's really insightful here is that Aristotle noticed that the formal and final cause often kind of coincide.
They often do,
Sure.
especially, in things that are made for a specific purpose.
Right.
So, the very definition of a knife, its form is linked to its function cutting.
Yeah.
And in living organisms, the essence of what they are aligns with their natural ends or activities.
Right.
Yeah.
And he also recognized that in biological reproduction,
Yes.
the efficient cause,
Mm-hmm.
a human parent produces something with the same form,
Right.
another human.
Another human.
So while Aristotle outlines these 4 causes,
Mm-hmm.
it becomes clear that matter and form
Yes.
play this particularly fundamental
Yes, they do.
and irreducible role in his explanatory framework.
Absolutely.
But this does kind of bring up a philosophical question.
Yeah.
I think, especially when we think about living organisms,
Mm-hmm.
their matter, our bodies,
Yeah.
it seems so intrinsically bound up with our being.
Mm-hmm.
Can the same elemental matter that makes up me now
Right.
become part of, something fundamentally different?
Right.
How did Aristotle kind of think through that?
Well, he addressed this by considering the relationship
Okay.
between the soul, which is the form of a living being, and the physical body, its matter.
Okay.
So he argued that a dead body
Mm.
is only called a body in this kind of derivative sense, this homonymous sense. It retains the physical shape, but it lacks the defining functions.
Yeah.
The animating principle, the soul. It's like calling a painted eye an eye.
Mm-hmm.
It has a superficial resemblance, but it lacks the essential capacity for sight.
Yeah.
For Aristotle, a living human body
Yeah.
is essentially ensouled.
Mhm.
Its form dictates its being and its activities.
And this leads us to different levels of matter.
Yes, it does.
Right.
So a human being's proximate matter
Mhm.
is their organized living body.
Mm-hmm.
But that body is made up of, further matter, organs, tissues, cells, ultimately reducible in Aristotle's physics to the 4 elements:
Right.
earth, air, fire, and water.
Mm-hmm.
And he distinguishes between what he
Actually-
calls homoiomorous parts,
Right.
like flesh or bone,
Mm-hmm.
which he believed were uniform throughout,
Okay.
and heteromerous parts, like
Yeah.
a hand or a face,
Okay.
which are composed of different kinds of stuff, arranged in a specific way.
Okay. So given that Aristotle rejected atomism
Right.
and believed in the infinite divisibility of matter,
Mm-hmm.
he posited that while the proximate matter of a living organism ceases to be
In the same way.
in the same way upon death,
Yeah.
the underlying elemental matter
Mm-hmm.
must persist through substantial change.
It must persist.
And this ensures, a continuous substrate.
Right.
It prevents things from just
Yeah.
emerging from or vanishing into absolute non-being.
Exactly. Now, I think we need to turn to a particularly complex and philosophically fertile area, the concept of prime matter.
Okay.
This is often understood as the ultimate fundamental level of Aristotle's hierarchy of matter.
Right.
It's the matter out of which the elements themselves are constituted.
Okay.
However, as our source rightly points out, this interpretation is the subject of a lot of debate among scholars.
So what's the philosophical motivation
Yeah.
for even proposing this idea of prime matter?
Well, Aristotle observed that the elements appear to be able to transform into one another.
Right.
So if water can become air, then following his own analysis of change, there must be some underlying substrate common to both that persists through the transformation.
Right.
This fundamental stuff couldn't be any of the elements themselves.
Right, because it needs to be able to.
Exactly, because it needs the potential
to
take on the distinct properties of each.
To become each of them.
To become each of them, right? So at one point it has to be wet and cold, and at another point it has to be wet and hot. So the traditional interpretation, which has been the prevalent one for centuries, really, is that Aristotle conceived of prime matter as this fundamental underlying substrate. It's often characterized as pure potentiality. So it has the capacity to receive any form.
But it lacks any inherent form or properties of its own.
Okay, so this creates a kind of a metaphysical counterpart to his concept of pure actuality in the unmoved movers.
Right.
Form without matter.
Form without matter.
And prime matter, in this view, is considered eternal, ubiquitous, and the ultimate ground of all physical reality and change.
That's right. And this sounds somewhat analogous to Plato's receptacle of all becoming in the Timaeus.
Right.
And our source actually draws this connection, suggesting that Aristotle might have been influenced by this idea from his teacher, albeit with significant modifications.
Yeah, but then we have this opposing viewpoint, which argues that the textual evidence for a fully developed concept of prime matter in Aristotle is insufficient. And some philosophers find the very idea
philosophically problematic. And they really argue against interpreting Aristotle in this way.
They do, and they often point to Aristotle's own criticisms of Plato's receptacle on generation and corruption as evidence against attributing a similar concept to him.
Okay, but even acknowledging his critique of Plato, Aristotle does employ the terms prom matter.
Yeah, it does.
Prote and primary underlying thing.
Yes, proton hupakaimenon.
Proton hupakaimenon in various texts.
In various texts.
Nevertheless, he also explicitly says that prime matter can refer contextually to either a thing's immediate proximate matter or to whatever constitutes it ultimately. He even mentions and rejects Thales' view that everything is fundamentally water. As an example of a specific material principle, not a truly general prime matter.
Not a truly general one.
Right.
Moreover, in metaphysics, IX.7, Aristotle uses conditional phrasing when he considers the possibility of a primary, that which is not made out of anything else. And he defines this hypothetically as prime matter. Which seems to suggest that he's exploring this as a concept rather than definitively asserting that it exists.
Okay, and then there's that pivotal passage in Metaphysics to 7.3 where Aristotle describes matter as that which in itself is neither a substance nor a quantity, nor anything else by which being is determined. Rather, it is that of which these are predicated. And this is a key text that's often interpreted as a description of prime matter, a completely indeterminate underlying reality, devoid of any specific characteristics.
And the philosophical objections to prime matter, I mean, they're substantial. Critics argue that it's inherently mysterious and unknowable. As you know, we never experience it directly. It's always matter that's already formed. More fundamentally, some argue that it's conceptually incoherent. How can something being characterized as pure potentiality, utterly devoid of essential properties, and yet somehow be the very basis for all properties in existence?
So, for example, in our earlier example, Socrates acquires the property of being blue. Does that mean there was some modification to the underlying prime matter?
Yeah, and to address this,
Yeah.
proponents of prime matter often propose
Mm-hmm.
distinguishing between the essential nature of prime matter,
Right.
which is this pure potentiality,
Yeah.
and the accidental properties that it takes on when it's formed.
Right.
But of course, this introduces the possibility of an infinite regress,
Right.
because if prime matter has an essential nature,
Right.
this potentiality,
Yeah.
what grounds that?
Yeah. It's a deeply challenging
It is.
issue.
Absolutely. And contemporary philosophers are still wrestling with this,
Yeah.
with the logical coherence of this concept.
Okay, so let's kind of shift our focus now to this idea of the principle of individuation.
Yes.
So this is the philosophical problem of what makes one particular thing numerically distinct from another thing of the same kind.
Right.
What makes Socrates, this specific human being, different from every other human?
Yes.
Is it matter?
Right.
Is it form? Or something else entirely?
Or something else entirely. This has been a central question, in metaphysics for millennia.
Yeah.
And as our source points out, some of the historical debate has been complicated by just a lack of clarity about what exactly a principle of individuation is meant to explain.
Right.
What are we looking for here? What is it that we need this principle to do?
Right.
And Popper's analysis of this exchange between Anscombe and Lukasiewicz, I think, is quite illuminating here. So Lukasiewicz argued that form is the source of individuality because it accounts for the unity of a composite thing.
Okay.
Right? So how do all the individual bricks constitute one house?
Right.
Aristotle seems to be invoking form to answer this question, what we might call a principle of unity.
Okay.
Right? How do the parts come together to form one thing?
Yeah.
Whereas Anscombe contended that it's matter that distinguishes one individual from another of the same species.
Right.
So Socrates is a distinct individual from Callias because the matter that makes up Socrates is numerically different from the matter that makes up Callias.
Right.
And this is traditionally understood as the principle of individuation as it relates to numerical distinctness.
Okay, so the traditional perspective has largely viewed individuation as a metaphysical issue.
Yes.
What fundamentally what makes things distinct?
Makes things distinct.
Yeah.
However, some contemporary interpretations suggest that Aristotle's primary concern might not have been this deep metaphysical question, but rather the epistemological one.
Yes.
How do we, in practice, distinguish
how do we tell them apart?
one individual from another?
Yeah.
Right.
Why seek a deeper metaphysical ground for distinctness?
Yeah.
Perhaps things just are numerically distinct, and that's where our explanation has to stop.
Right.
If we propose matter as the individuating principle, then we face the question of what distinguishes one portion of matter from another portion of matter.
Yeah, and it seems to lead to a potentially circular or self-referential explanation.
Yeah, exactly. If we say this particular quantity of matter is distinct from that particular quantity of matter because it is this quantity of matter.
Right. It doesn't feel like.
It doesn't feel like we've said anything. We've really offered a genuine explanation.
It's like saying, Socrates is distinct from Callias because he is Socrates.
Yeah.
It's true, but it doesn't give you any ground for their distinctness.
Right. Yeah. Nevertheless, the dominant interpretation has been that Aristotle was indeed addressing this metaphysical question of what underlies numerical difference.
Numerical difference.
And there are two key passages in his works that are frequently cited to support matter as the principle of individuation.
That's right. So the first one is found in Metaphysics v.6, where Aristotle states that things are one in number whose matter is one. And the traditional reading takes this to mean that numerical identity is grounded in having the very same underlying matter.
Right.
However, an alternative interpretation suggests that this refers to unity rather than strict identity.
Okay.
So a thing is numerically one if its constituent matter forms a continuous, unified whole.
Okay.
The second passage is from Metaphysics 7.8, where it's stated that Socrates and Callias differ in virtue of their matter, for that is different, but the same in form.
Right.
This appears to be a pretty direct statement that difference in matter underlies numerical difference between individuals of the same species.
Right.
But here, too, an alternative reading exists, that different here signifies qualitatively different,
Right.
not necessarily numerically distinct.
Okay.
So Socrates and Callias might differ
Yeah.
in their specific material instantiations
Okay.
of the shared human form,
Right.
which leads to different accidental properties.
Okay, this leads us to a really challenging puzzle
It does.
that's posed by Fine.
Mm-hmm.
And this puzzle directly questions the adequacy of matter
Mm-hmm.
as the principle of individuation.
Yeah.
So the argument basically says that Socrates and Callias could, in principle,
Right.
possess numerically the same elemental matter
Mm-hmm.
at different points in time,
Mm-hmm.
and they share the same universal form, humanity.
Right.
And given that they're considered composites of matter and form,
Mm-hmm.
if both their matter and form could be numerically identical,
Right.
it would seemingly follow that they themselves
Yeah.
could be numerically identical, which is obviously
impossible.
impossible.
That's right.
Yeah. So what are some potential responses to this puzzle?
Well, one approach is to argue
Yeah.
that the term matter
Mm-hmm.
is being used ambiguously.
Right.
Perhaps Socrates and Callias share fundamental elemental matter,
Yeah.
but they have distinct proximate matter
Mm-hmm.
in their individual bodies.
Yep.
But as our source points out,
Yeah.
the puzzle can be reformulated
Mm.
to address this potential equivocation.
Okay.
Another rejoinder might be to question the premise
Mm-hmm.
that a person's specific matter
Yeah.
is essential to their identity across time.
Right.
So while Aristotle likely holds that our proximate organic matter
Yeah.
is essential for our being,
Mhm.
as living organisms,
Right.
he seems to allow for the possibility of the underlying elemental matter
Mm-hmm.
existing independently and,
Huh.
and being rearranged.
Okay. I think a potentially more fruitful avenue, though,
Okay.
lies in challenging this idea that Socrates and Callias share
Mm-hmm.
a numerically identical form.
Yeah.
So if one subscribes to the notion of particularized forms,
Mhm.
forms that are unique to each individual instantiation,
Right.
then Socrates and Callias would differ in form,
Mm-hmm.
even if their underlying matter were the same.
Yes. But of course, this raises the further problem of how these particular forms themselves are individuated
Right.
without resorting to circularity.
Right. So then finally, some interpretations suggest that our understanding of a composite substance
Yeah.
as simply the union of matter and form at a given moment
Right.
might be too simplistic.
Too simplistic.
Perhaps a substance should be understood as a composite of its form
Mm-hmm.
and all the matter it has successively possessed throughout its existence.
Interesting.
Or, alternatively,
Yeah.
the very notion of a composite might need to be relativized
Mm-hmm.
to a specific time
Right.
or even a possible world.
Yeah.
But as our source notes,
Mm.
these alternative views can sometimes conflict with
Yeah.
Aristotle's emphasis on form
Mm-hmm.
as the unifying principle of a composite.
Right.
So while there is some textual basis
Right.
for considering matter as the principle of individuation
Mm-hmm.
in Aristotle's philosophy,
Yes.
our exploration kind of reveals that particularized forms
Mm-hmm.
might offer a more robust solution. Or indeed that Aristotle's primary focus might have been on the principle of unity
Right.
rather than a strict metaphysical account
Yeah.
of numerical distinctness.
Exactly. It remains a complex
Yeah.
and actively debated aspect of his thought.
Okay, so for our final segment then,
Okay.
let's delve into this a seemingly paradoxical concept
Right.
of matter involving forms.
Okay.
So we've largely discussed matter and form as kind of distinct and contrasting principles,
Yes.
somewhat reminiscent of Plato's separated forms.
Right.
But Aristotle insisted that his forms are inherently enmeshed within matter
Enmeshed within matter in the natural world.
in the natural world.
Yeah.
Yeah, he